Dr. Papadopoulos, the European reactions, especially the German, there were those who condemned what the Vance said. There were those who spoke about the structure of the values in Europe. Between these two, what are the dangers, or what the European leaders consider to be dangers in the vision which the Vance presented?
J.D. Vance's speech echoed the opinions of the ancient nations of Europe, such as Britons, Irish, Swedes, Germans, Italians, French, and Spaniards. For many decades now, the ancient nations of Europe have been attacked by the European elites. The European elites have waged a cultural war on the ancient nations of Europe, in which the European elites are attempting to destroy the cultural and spiritual values of the ancient nations of Europe. Europe is not democratic. Europe is not free. The European Union is not Europe, and Europe is most certainly not the European Union. The Arab world knows me as a friend to the Arab. That is why I ask the Arab world to listen to me very carefully. In Europe, such as in Britain and in Germany, the British people and the German people have been told by the European elites that they must support immigration, they must support multiculturalism, they must support BLM, they must support LGBTQ, they must support Israel, they must support Zelensky, they must be anti-Palestine, they must be anti-Russia, and so on and so on. If the ordinary man and woman in Europe does not support what I have just mentioned, then they are vilified, they are demonized. Indeed, they are treated as dirt. Worse still, many ordinary men and women in Europe, such as in Britain and in Germany, have been sent to prison because they oppose, for example, immigration, they oppose multiculturalism, they oppose supporting Israel, they oppose supporting Western wars of intervention in West Asia. So again, what J.D. Vance said echoed the opinions of the ordinary man and woman across Europe. For so many years now, the ordinary man and woman in Europe has seen their culture spat on, has seen their culture urinated on. Europe is not free. That is why I urge the Arab world to understand that there is no such thing as a far-right movement in Europe. No, the elites in Europe who are pro-Israel will use any terminology to try and dirty the opinions and the names of people who disagree with their policies, be it over immigration or be it over Israel. The European people were never asked if they agree to immigration. Never were they asked. Never was their consent asked for. They were simply ignored. That is why Europe is not democratic. Europe is not free.
Mr. Deroche, if we have sound now, I'm not sure if we do, but I'll repeat the question, or I'll ask you a few questions. Mr. Deroche, now what drew my attention was Olaf Scholz's response to J.D. Vance's comments. Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, said some words which we've never heard before, especially when he spoke, or when the European partners speak with the US. Scholz launched an attack on J.D. Vance and said fascism will not return at all to Europe. It's as if he's accusing the Vance and the Trump administration of wanting to restore fascism to Europe. What led the situation to reach this stage?
Well, I think there's two things. The first thing is seen in context, in the American context of the Trump administration, which has an ideology that is not entirely dissimilar to what we just heard from the speaker previously. There's been the rise of an unaccountable administrative state that has a major impact upon people's lives in the United States, in Canada, as well as in Europe, but that is unelected, and that it doesn't matter who you vote for, the administrative state manages to persevere onward. That's primarily, Vance is coming from an American point of view with that, and we're talking about things like environmental regulations. In Europe, obviously, the major issue is immigration, in particular 2016 when Chancellor Merkel opened the doors to immigration in Germany and by extension in all of Europe. Vance's comments, I think, were seen by Scholz as a challenge to the whole European Union enterprise, which has led to unprecedented peace and prosperity in Europe. But it comes out of a desire to prevent the two great crises of the 20th century. The first was World War I, epitomized by Verdun, and the second was the rise of fascism in Germany and in Italy. Whenever the European Union is challenged, you get one of the two responses after a certain period. It's either Verdun or fascism. And I think that given the electoral weakness that Scholz's coalition has and the problems he's facing with an electorate that is primarily motivated by skepticism towards immigration, as well as the challenges of the rich countries of Northern Europe subsidizing the poorer countries, and in their view, the corrupt countries of Southern Europe in the context of the European Union, I think he's going back to the base narrative.
Mr. Birosh, as I was listening to Donald Trump's statements and the Vance statements and Elon Musk as well and other Americans, I'm trying to understand the broader lines of the American policy in deep depth, be it in the U.S. or abroad. Mm-hmm. What seems to me to be the case is that there is an attempt to cause deep changes in international policies and in the ideologies and in the perspective towards vital issues. Do you think, Mr. DeRoche, that 4 years of Donald Trump and those who are with him in the White House, do you think this is enough to bring about this huge change which they're talking about in Europe, in Asia, and even in the United States, America itself?
Well, the primary focus of Trump and Trump's supporters is domestically. I think that they view the like-minded democracies of Europe in particular as subject to the same rise of the administrative state, as they call it, more so because they have a flawed accountability mechanism in the European Union. And you've had examples of the Treaty of Lisbon, which was rejected by France and was later on incorporated into law without popular referenda. But Trump's agenda is domestic. And again, what we've seen is in the United States since really the Franklin Roosevelt administration, we've seen the rise of bodies with government that are not directly elected, that make policies that have great impact upon the average American. And I think Trump's base views them as too powerful, too unaccountable. They see policies not changing even though they have elections where they voted for changes because of this. So I think what he wants to do is shrink what he calls the administrative state, which, by the way, he sees as a core Democrat constituency, and go back to a more limited model of government like we had with Roosevelt's administration, the Franklin Roosevelt administration, where the federal government is only exercising powers that are specifically voted on by Congress and by the president, not that are made by boards who are appointed by the consent of Congress, but then who are able to set wide-ranging policies without reference to Congress or the president. I'm sorry, that's a lot of U.S. inside baseball.
But here I'd like to understand something, Mr. DeRoche. Speaking about liberalism in the US and the traditional institutions and the bureaucratic institutions and globalization in its previous form, can this lead us to say that Trump's agenda in the current American administration is not linked to the age, how long it's going to continue, but rather a movement which is rising in the US? It's not linked to Trump or to a certain time frame. Am I right to say this?
Trump has certainly tapped into a vein of public opinion, which feels that it didn't matter if they voted for Bill Clinton or George W. Bush. They got the same output from government, and people felt that their government was unresponsive to their needs, particularly if you look at things like the deindustrialization of the U.S. Midwest, where it didn't matter what party you voted for, the policies were the same, plants were being shut down because of environmental regulations that Congress had not voted on. This is the genius, the political genius of Trump, which is that he has managed to identify a major group of voters in the United States who other parties have neglected or have underserved. So I think that is correct. But in terms of liberalism, he actually harkens back to classic liberalism, which is what we had in the United States really before the Woodrow Wilson administration in 1912. That's sort of a weak role of government in the everyday life of citizens, and it ties in with isolationism, which also concerns our European partners and allies.
And here I'd like to get the perspective of my guest, Marcus Papadopoulos in London, as Le Monde that said, I'd like to get your point of view. The Le Monde, the French newspaper, says that the American vice president declared ideological war on Europe and tried to flirt with the far right in Europe. The Hill said that, and he started the battle of identity with Europe, supporting the far right parties in Europe. Some, Dr. Papadopoulos, are starting to talk about Trumpism within the European elite, and they're reflected by the third bloc in the European Parliament, which was recently formed.
The response of Western mainstream media to the speech of J.D. Vance was inversion at its most inverted. It is the Western ruling elites who have been waging a cultural and ideological war against the ancient nations of Europe. Who is it who flooded Europe with immigrants? Who is it who is systematically destroying the cultural and spiritual values of the ancient nations of Europe? It is not Donald Trump. It is not Russia. It is not Iran. It is not Palestine. It is the Western ruling elites. Let us be very clear about that. The European ruling elites, who of course are a key element in the Western ruling elites, are steeped up to their necks in Arab blood. The European ruling elites are the ones who played a very major role in bringing terrorists, Al-Qaeda and ISIS, to power in Syria, in bringing Al-Qaeda to power in Libya. Let us not forget how many Arabs, including women and children, have died because of sanctions of the European Union and various wars of intervention that the European Union has supported and indeed taken part in. And when the European ruling elites, when the Western ruling elites in general talk about far right, there is no such thing as far right. Let's have a look at these nationalist and patriotic parties in Europe. They have made it very clear that if they come to power, for example in Germany, there will be no more wars of intervention in West Asia. There will be no more aid to Israel. What is wrong with that? But of course, the Western ruling elites want to continue waging wars against the Arab people. They want to continue funding Israel. They want to keep on facilitating Israel's genocidal war against the Palestinian people. So, for example, AfD in Germany oppose that. The recent elections in Romania, where an anti-European ruling elite candidate won, what was the response of the European elites? They cancelled that victory. In Germany, AfD is very close to come into power. So what has the German ruling elite resorted to? They are trying to ban the AfD. Again, I speak to the Arab world. Do not fall for terminology such as far right. That terminology is designed to keep the Western ruling elites in power in North America, in Europe, and in Australasia. The Western ruling elites do not represent the ordinary Western man and woman. The ordinary Western man and woman does not support Israel. The ordinary Western man and woman does not support Western wars of intervention, such as the invasion of Iraq. But the Western ruling elites do. Again, that is why I say Europe is not democratic. Europe is not free. By me simply expressing an opinion in Britain, I can be arrested and sent to prison. I'm not hurting anyone. I'm not encouraging violence against anyone. But because, for example, I don't support Israel, I could be sent to prison. Because I don't support immigration or multiculturalism, I could be sent to prison. I want the Arab people to have their culture preserved. I also want the British culture to be preserved. What's wrong with that? The problem is that the Western ruling elites hate the ancient nations of Europe. They hate the cultural and spiritual values of the Western nations. That is why they have flooded Europe with immigrants. And again, the ordinary man and woman in Europe was never asked if they want to see immigrants come to Europe. How is that democracy?
Mr. De Roche, I'll conclude with you with a point also related to what the Europeans consider to be, or that the US, the Trump administration, is adopting a unilateral approach, ignoring the traditional framework of cooperating, the transatlantic cooperation. And the European elites sense that the Trump administration is trying to marginalize them from the international issues which they used to collaborate in, and there are fears regarding the American steps which could be taken regarding ending the war in Ukraine, and they accuse the American administration, or they are concerned about the contacts being with Russia and Zelensky to end this war without giving a role or at the expense of Europe. What are the United States' interests in marginalizing the European leaders?
Yeah, I think that there is a domestic interest. So nobody who was at the Munich Security Conference welcomed the election of Donald Trump. And I think that he senses, there is a transatlantic affinity between the generic policy elite, for example, high-level officials of the European Union and most European governments, and the Democratic Party rather than Donald Trump. Most notably, the British Labour Party sent campaign workers to work for Kamala Harris. So I think he is, first off, personally not too close to these folks. The second thing is, his instincts are isolationist, but that does not mean that he's calling for a complete withdrawal, because we are a trading nation, and we realize that our prosperity is based upon having trading partners that we can interact with. So I don't think that there'll be like a withdrawal from Europe, but in common with every president in my lifetime, he does want to see Europeans contribute more to their own debt. And I think that there is a sense that, all right, Ukraine is a European crisis. The European countries, if they want to, have the ability to support Ukraine on their own. But the United States needs to focus on rising China, which the European countries do not have the ability to do. So I think that some of this is gamesmanship. Some of it is just the fact that the United States is strategically situated in a different place. But if you look at the appointments Trump has made for European policy, they are people in his European circle. They're not the sort of people he would put on a portfolio that he plans to abandon. And I think that the relationship, there'll be a more heated rhetoric, but at the end of the day, the relationship will remain solid. Hopefully the Europeans will step up and contribute more to their own defense and to regional stability.
Thank you very much, Mr. David Roche from National Defense University, and thank you very much to Mr. Marcus Papadopoulos, expert on international affairs. Thank you very much for joining us.